Chapter 1. Goodbyes and Farewells. What stands before me is the great unknown. Tomorrow I will head for the New World, but now I am looking at my fellow soldiers. Standing around on the wharf are 50 of the best soldiers in España. Each group is chatting about different concerns. I realize that we are the best and most lethal soldiers in our country, which is why soon we all will be thousands and thousands of leagues away in the Indias Occidentales. Our alferez, Alonso Francisco Arellano, opens with his speech. "Everyone focus! Calm down, men! Listen to me!" There was silence as the alferez spoke. "Thank you! I am glad most of you made an appearance. Tomorrow is a big day for all of us. Now, out of everyone here, a few of you may never see home again. I pray that I am incorrect, and all of us return. Over the next year, you will be facing the biggest challenges in your lives." Everyone is listening intently. The crowd is packed tight together, arms over shoulders. Alferez Arellano continued. "There are many dangers ahead. Not being serious about guarding our fleet will prove fatal." I kept looking around in everyone's eyes. "Spend the night with your families and friends, because tomorrow we set sail for the Indias Occidentales." With an explosion of screaming and hollering, all of Seville's inhabitants heard us. Alferez Arellano screamed with a smile, "Calm down! I want to pray." Interrupting our jubilance, he calmly said, "Jesus Christ and His Mother Mary, full of grace, and Heavenly Father, please listen to your servants. Tomorrow, as we all sail across the ocean to new Christian lands, help us realize the sacredness of human life. Help us extend our hand of mercy and the other of authority. Help us enforce the obedience of the laws of España. Let our soul's health and our bodies profit from this voyage. Protect us, all of us. Amen." All of us had our heads down during the prayer. Alferez Arellano continued, "Are you men ready?" Instantly my hearing was hurt again. Our cheers and howls were so honest and pure. This made me ecstatic, taking part in the great unknown together. That is why I fight for my brothers and they fight for me. We all were boisterously jumping up and down and yelling and shoving each other. In each of us the sense for adventure loudly called, and none of us could ignore its beckoning. Alferez Arellano said, "Good night, soldiers. Get some sleep. España is proud of you all." "Well, men, this is it. We've been waiting for this moment," I said. My best friend Philip, who is reliable and strong, asked me, "Alonso, where are you going tonight?" "With Maria, obviously," I said. Philippe replied, "You would. We are all going to be abroad for the next 12 months. We now have money, people are waiting for us, and we are in Seville. Let's go to the taverns." My other friend Antonio, known for his handsome face, incessant wenching, and humor, spoke up. "Maria should join us." "Wrong idea," I said. "Let him do his thing, Philippe. We have good times to make." Pedro said. Pedro is a fascinating person. He is either level-headed when in the right company or badly tempered when not. I told everyone good night, hopped in my carriage, and rode towards my waiting wife. Philip, Antonio, and Pedro ran off in a rented carriage. They were going over the bridge into Triana to raise hell. I am not going to feel guilty spending the night with my wife Maria. She is the most petite thing. She is strong-willed. That is occasionally a bad thing, but adorable nonetheless. She has thick black hair. She always wraps in a bun. She loves gossiping with her friends and has the most angelic voice. I pulled up under the Portecochere, the house where we are guests. It's Maria's father's friend's house. Before going to see Maria, I took an indirect route to our room. I wanted to stop by the host family's brick-paved patio and pick jasmine. I walked out back towards their fountain-fed garden. I quietly ripped some out of the black soil. Walking up to our room, my thoughts of Maria magnified. I fantasized about saying to her, "I have decided to remain here by your side." Before entering the room, I paused. I was imagining her and me in better circumstances. Then I entered the room and called out, "Maria!" There she was writing in her journal. She rose and quietly walked to the window as if to postpone reality. I sprinted to her side. I said, "Let's not make this so bitter." I gently rubbed the jasmine down her face. She closed her eyes and inhaled the fragrance. I picked her up and spun her around in my arms. While looking at me, I noticed her distress. I said to alleviate her feelings, "Do you remember when we first met?" Through her teary eyes a smile burst, just as sun rays through grey clouds. She said, smiling, "Yes, at the Corrales de la Cruz. You invited me to your private box to watch the performance." We then laughed about past events in our lives that we shared together. This was honestly a tough change in our lives. Our last night together felt like it was in slow motion. I told her how difficult it was for me to leave behind such a pretty woman. I leaned in, kissing her on her lips, neck, and etc. Towards midnight, she quietly rolled on top of me and asked, "Must you go?" I could not find the words, but I tried to respond by saying, "The money and prospects of wealth for us can be achieved only this way." She blinked her eyes and rested her head on my chest. "Do you remember the handful of ducatos I brought home when I signed on with the Captain General? There is much more to come." I felt in her heart that she envisioned me making a living in another fashion, not as a soldier. I asked her, "Do you wish I was a letrado, or a licentiate, instead of a soldier?" Maria said, "Sometimes, only because I have heard husbands abandon their wives once they are in the New World. Promise me I will see you again." I kissed her and said, "That fear is baseless. It exists only in your head." She gave a worried smile. "Captain General Alvaro Flores de Valdez won't allow me to stay. I am a married man. It would be illegal." She nodded. "Alonso, a couple months ago when you were levied, I was excited. Now I think about what will happen when you are gone and I get scared." I responded, "You will be comfortable, sweetheart. The loans I set up for you will pay in 6 months." I made sure that happens. We laid in bed. The silence that came between us made me distraught. "This is absurd. We are in Seville. Let's go for a stroll," I said. I helped Maria into her bodice and then clothed myself. While on our walk, we avoided the Arenal area because criminals linger there at night. We strolled through the Plaza de San Francisco. The sound of the fountain filled the midnight air. There was still a large amount of people in the area. Amongst us were mostly couples and a few beggars unable to sleep. The Carrera de Indias fleet was scheduled to depart tomorrow. This brought out those inclined to make the most of their night. We walked a short distance away to the Alameda de Hercules. This beautiful park was like a miniature forest. We were walking side by side. I was telling her about the Roman monument that once existed at the site. She was telling me about the orange trees blossoming this time of year and their nice smell. We walked back to our house. We talked softly while caressing each other until the sun rose. Just as my eyes could close, I heard 3 culverins fire down on the river. This meant that in 6 hours, the tide would be high enough for us to leave. It was the morning. Maria and I had not slept completely. The servant rang the morning bell and knocked on the door. My eyes were already open and focusing on the early day-lit sky. I could hear traffic on the street outside and people's conversations. The breeze entered our room, swaying the curtains. The realization that we were finally embarking today heightened my senses. Everything was more stimulating. I whispered in Maria's ear, "In 1 year, we will be in each other's arms just like this, but more wealthy." Her face was looking out the window too. She didn't say anything but began caressing my arm. I knew that she was saying she understood. We remained nestled together for some time. I kissed her and exited the bed. I went and put on my white chemise, old brown doublet and buff coat. The servant entered with warm water in the ewer and a towel. After the servant left, Maria slipped out of her nightgown. I watched Maria as she clothed herself in a serge bodice, corset and bonnet. While she painted her face, I said, "You always look beautiful in a bonnet." She looked at me with a smile. We then raced to our carriage and trundled down to the wharf. Maria's parents spent the night in the host home also. They were trailing us in their carriage. The town was alive with activity. Streets were filled with onlookers waiting for the embarkation of the fleet to the Indias Occidentales. We depart in a few hours, and with it a huge portion of our empire's wealth. This was the first moment I questioned what I was doing. Supporting King Felipe II in the church, I guess. "Driver, deter to French Street real quick," I said. "Alonso, what are you doing?" Maria gently asked. "You will see later," I said. The driver took us to where I requested. "Stop here," I said. I stepped out and ran over to a shopkeeper. I handed him a ducato and 8 reales. He handed me a jeweled necklace. I stepped back in the coach and we continued. "What did you give that man?" Maria asked. With a smirk, I said, "Nothing." Maria commented, "French Street is exclusively expensive merchandise." "You are smart, and that's why I married you." We arrived at the wharf with Maria's parents by our side. Men and families denied passage to the New World stood around, futilely appealing their hardships. They were screaming out anything they could think of to be in our position. We walked through the Arenal gate, entering the Street of the Sea. This place had people running around that were even more frantic than those outside the gate. In front of us, the cathedral steps and the portico above them was where most of the attention centered. I was looking for Alferez Arellano. I found him under our banner, blowing in the soft breeze. "Good morning, Alonso. Good morning, Maria. You look beautiful this morning," he said. "Good morning, Alferez. Can you tell me which warship we sail on?" I asked. "We are in the San Indalecio. Philip, Antonio, and Pedro are near it. They came here very early, smelling like a tavern. We have muster call in an hour. Tell them to sober up before then," Alferez Arellano said. "Yes, sir," I replied. I started walking over to where Alferez Arellano pointed. Pedro, Philip, and Antonio were staying in a collective residence called a corrales. Their corrales is on Peral Street, and every time I have gone there, trash surrounds the building. Inside the corrales, I have always seen men that are hopeless, limbless, or feeble-minded. My men fit in there because it is very cheap to stay and meals are included. I presume they just left from there after grabbing their belongings. They were in a circle, joyfully talking. They screamed my name for all to hear. "Alonso Truilos!" The four of us have known each other since childhood. When they are together in a semi-intoxicated mood like this, it is impossible for them not to make a scene. I ignored their boisterous noise level. "Are you ready for today?" I asked. All of them smelt like alcohol. Philip replied, "Of course. We are only sailing halfway around the world on this piece of timber." Antonio hobbled over and said, "Good morning!" I noticed him injured and asked, "What happened to you?" Philip and Pedro started laughing. Philip said to Antonio, "Tell Alonso how stupid you are." Antonio ignored the insult and said, "Last night after we departed, I took Alferez Arellano's advice about spending the night with—" Philip interrupted. "No, tell him how you got close with Annabel the married woman." Antonio continued, "So yes, Alferez Arellano expected us to be with the ones we loved, and I paid a visit to Annabel the married woman. It was the best night of my life. She knew it would be our last together and was eager to have me as a guest. Since her husband was away, supposed to be away, I accepted the invitation." Philip again excitedly interposed, this time to narrate his favorite part. "So, yes, Antonio was in bed with Annabel, the married woman, probably serenading her, when Annabel's actual husband interrupted them by smashing in the door." Antonio picked up the story. "Yes, it was inconvenient. Her husband entered the room with an arquebus and 3 or 4 of the men." When I heard the irate husband had an arquebus, I was in disbelief. "What happened next?" I asked. Antonio replied, "I simultaneously kissed her goodbye and jumped over the second-floor balustrade and sprinted off." I laughed when I heard this. "Did he fire his arquebus?" I asked. Philip and Pedro laughed before Antonio answered. "Yes, but he aimed too slow, or I was too quick, because he missed." "So do you regret it?" Antonio answered with a smile. "No, Annabel is the most gorgeous woman in Seville." I said, "Yes, that confirms it. You are a fool. My advice, hide your limp and your face." Pedro spoke up and said to Antonio, "Alonso is right. Annabel's husband would not miss his second shot." Philip sighed. "Antonio, that was bad. You almost got shot by Annabel's husband." "What about the rest of you? Did you all almost die for your last night in España? Or get placed in jail?" I asked the others. Philippe said, "We all started out our night at the Court of Elms, and the rest we will tell you later." "Was that a good time?" I asked Pedro. Pedro then grabbed both my shoulders. "Yes, but there is something you must know. Upon hearing of joining the fleet to the Indias Occidentales, I first thought it was insane." Our whole lives, Pedro seemed to me to be a cautious person. He was looking me in the eyes, waiting for my response. I was looking at his chubby, animated face. I said, "Now how do you feel? Unambitious?" Our big entourage then started proceeding to walk along the street of the sea. Pedro said, "I am excited more than ever. I just want to thank you." Antonio said, "When Alonso told me I should sign up with him, I was already planning on leaving España." Philippe said, "I believe it, probably because you have made a dozen men look like cuckolds." Antonio shoved Philip. Philip started laughing and returned the insult. Pedro ignored them and continued saying, "Alonso, when you invited me to join this fleet back in February, I never imagined I would someday be heading to the Indias Occidentales." "Yes, same here," I said. We finally feasted our eyes on the San Indalecio, out in the river. The outer hull was painted red and black. The words gilded on the side read San Indalecio. Her length was about 45 varas, with 3 masts. I then decided to focus on Maria, who was looking at our ship. I reached out and held her hand. Maria's father, Alejandro, said, "Alonso, I will miss you. Work intelligently. When you return, do so with satisfactory news." He said this with a stern look. Maria's mother, also petite and attractive in her age, kissed me goodbye. Alejandro asked, "What weapons are aboard the San Indelicio?" Alejandro was always interested in the newest gunpowder weapons. I said, "From what I know, a minimum of 25 guns, each shooting balls weighing from 5 to 40 libras. You can count the gun ports along the side of her. I figure 10 culverins and 10 demi-culverins," Alejandro said. Pedro said, "The strongest vessel on the seas." Philip laughed and said, "It better be." Alejandro said, "Well, I hope you boys are safe. Senor Felipe II has invested a lot in you." Antonio, sounding desperate, said, "When do we board?" I pointed out to him, "If you look over at those tenders, they are bringing the ship's bill of ladings. Once approved, we embark." While they were all studying this wonderment around them, I was glancing around the giant crowd. All around us, people were saying their goodbyes. In this crowd, a woman was sitting down with her face buried in her hands, her husband rubbing her head. Parents, brothers, and sisters were hugging their loved ones goodbye. They were crying, children being handed around and kissed, infants being held in their father's arms. Hundreds of people's goodbyes imbued the air. The muster for each ship was called. The sum of the soldiers was in sight. For our ship, there were 4 squadrons, 25 men each. After muster, it was time to pay for our valises and have them inspected. A long line of over 100 men passing under the Inquisition inspector's green cross flag stood in the way of boarding. We began walking. I stopped for a moment to say goodbye to Maria. "Alonso, you coming?" Philip asked. "Be right there," I yelled. Time had finally been arrested. I pulled out the necklace with a jeweled cross amulet attached to it. She blushed. I felt good about it. She said, "Alonso, thank you." I hung the necklace around her neck, then grabbed her by the legs and easily raised her in the air. She pulled herself towards me and we embraced. After I let go, she pulled out a book wrapped in a rag. "I know you like to read. This I thought you would find interesting while you are in the Indias Occidentales." I began opening it. She stopped me. "Wait until you have nothing to do. That should be soon from what I hear." I looked at her one last time, her blue eyes looking into mine. She's mine, and it is a good thing, too. "I will see you in my dreams. Until then, keep that around your neck." Then my legs quickly went racing into the boarding line with everyone else. I did not turn around. The disconnection between us had to be final. There the inspectors stood in their cassocks. I said, "I really hope all of you left your contraband back in Triana." Pedro whispered, "I have playing cards." "Where?" I asked. "That is for me to worry about." The inspectors called out to the soldiers, "If you are on the San Indelicio, line up with everyone else. If not, you are in the wrong line." There were 2 Inquisition inspectors looking for banned books and an inspector from the House of Trade looking for contraband. Pedro was ahead of me. He was asked, "Do you have any books banned by the Grand Inquisitor or other heretical material?" "No," Pedro replied. They asked him to open up his valise and they went through it. Then he passed on, following Antonio. "Do you have any books banned by the Grand Inquisitor or heretical material you are taking with you?" "No," I said. After the delay from the Inquisition inspectors, my crew started boarding the San Indelicio. The Guadalquivir looked like a winter forest. There were so many masts crowding the sky. We stepped off the gangway and onto the San Indelicio. The first view of the ship's innards. "This is enormous," Philip said. "This oak must be the finest in España," Antonio said. The mariners were easily recognizable. They were bare-chested and long-bearded. They were climbing ropes and they were moving cargo. None of them were looking around in amazement like us. We saw our sergeant, Felipe Beltran. "Heavy containers are stored in the lowest open space," he shouted to the stevedores. He was frantic. A short, stocky man with black curly hair, wearing a velvet cap, spoke. "I am the Escribano Nicholas. Felipe wants me to show you soldiers your sleeping quarters. Follow me." We picked up our belongings and raced down the companionway with Nicholas. Once below deck, we were shown where soldiers sleep. Pedro disapprovingly said, "Our sleeping quarters." "It's so spacious and the temperature is perfect," Philip sarcastically said. Our sleeping quarters were small, and it was hot down there, even before midday. Pedro asked, "How are all these soldiers sleeping here?" I laughed and made an announcement. "If you are planning on turning around, go up on the deck to do it." Everyone that heard me laughed. We looked around, and rows of hammocks hung from the deckhead beams. Pedro said, "I have heard of these, but never slept in one." A fellow soldier said, "They are called hammocks. The Carib Indios invented them." Pedro laughed and said, "They look like fish nets. How is this new?" The fellow soldier shook his head and went back to his business. We claimed our territory, threw our belongings down, and returned to the bright upper deck. The four of us ran towards the gunwale to get a final view and wave goodbye to Seville. We were so excited for the future and what adventures were awaiting us. "This is an amazing vessel. I want to learn how she operates," I said. "Why? We guard her, not sail her," Philip said. I replied, "Learning a little will not hurt." The captain, in his red sash and baton, ordered 2 mariners to climb the foremast and wait on the yard. He yelled up to them, saying, "Here's the rope on the foresail, men." At hearing this, a man blew his whistle. Then a shrieking noise emanated from anchor davits. I went below deck to investigate how the anchors were moved. I saw mariners chanting a song as they pushed capstan bars around in a circle. They all had Galician accents. The anchors began raising. After they finished, they began walking up to the deck. I ran up to the main deck before them. We caught the first drafts of wind. The dozen ships in our fleet began moving. The San Indalecio had 3 drummers and 3 trumpeters. Each of their musical instruments began being beaten and blown. The captain ordered us to be quiet, so he could begin his ceremonial introduction. "I am Captain Francisco Agustin of the San Indalecio. For 9 years she has served this fleet. She was collared by corsairs for 2 years, back in the early 70s. By good fortune, I had her again presented to me. Thus I resumed command of this vessel. I have duties to take care of, and am going to give a brief blessing." We all stood on the main deck listening. Captain Francisco Agustin began his prayer. "In the name of the Holy Trinity, return us all safely home. Guide these men's souls out of any and all temptation. Give each man the wholehearted strength to follow commands. Especially, we pray that we encounter no problems over the next week. Amen." The mariners first chanted Amen, then lagging were the voice of us soldiers. The ship the Captain General is on, everyone calls the Capitana. It is the constant vanguard of our convoy. The Capitana began leading us down the Guadalquivir. After the prayer, a salvo filled the civilian air from the Capitana's guns. Everyone was cheering and started talking. Felipe, our sergeant, said, "Keep quiet until given the sound to speak. The Guadalquivir pilot needs silence." Everyone was silent as our river pilot navigated the Guadalquivir. On our stern, the other half-dozen vessels followed us. We watched as the crowd and finally the Giralda moved out of sight. We slowly moved down the river all day. Along the banks, people attended the spectacle. The scenery of our country became more appealing. Grasses and trees, whose verdure had increased lately, sprung out of the fields. Looking back towards Seville, the Guadalquivir glistened under the midday sun. When the captain's watch began at the 16th hour, a 12-year-old boy shouted out, "Blessed be our voyage! May the captain's watch be safe and all aboard keep their faith!" This page then opened into the Pater Noster and Ave Maria. After he left, Pedro told me about the rest of their night. After hearing details of their stupidity, I decided to socialize with new faces. Some men were standing and talking at the prow. I walked up and introduced myself to the 4 looking out into the countryside. "My name is Alonso," I said. All 4 of them introduced themselves as Diego, Ramirez, Gregoria, Jose, and Hipólito. "Any of you sailed out here before?" They laughed. "We all went with the fleet last year, which was our first tour," Diego Ramirez said. "I have waited almost 3 months for today," I said. "We had just finished an unsuccessful advance at Mamora 2 weeks ago. We came to Seville just in time for enlistment," Diego Ramirez said. "Mamora, are your men soldiers?" "Never, we are the gunners," Diego Ramirez said. "Gunners?" I said out loud. "Yes," Hipólito replied. "How many guns are on this ship?" I asked. Diego Ramirez answered, "There are 10 culverins, 8 demi-culverins, and 2 cannons." "That is something. I've used cannons on land before, but not at sea," I said. "It is louder in the gun deck," Hipólito said. Diego Ramirez said, "I am sure you will get a chance to use them at sea." "Yes, I was wondering, how do you aim on a rocking vessel?" I asked. "The most crucial part is feeling the motion of the waves," Diego Ramirez said. "The precise time to fire is really instinct," Jose said. Diego Ramirez corrected Jose. Instinct about knowing the rhythm of the ocean, you mean? Gregoria said. You both are wrong. You could have the best timing on your part, but the helmsman is really in control. I listened to their thoughts on firing guns. What do we do about supper? I asked them. Diego Ramirez responded, Supper should be soon. Do we make our own meals? Diego Ramirez said, I imagine you bought your food. Tell the pages to prepare it for you. I said, no. My men and I were going to buy food for the voyage, but never did. Instead, we are eating from the cruise rations. Diego Ramirez said, same with us. The pages will make them. Gregoria said, pages do everything for you. They are the scullions, the cooks, and whatever nobody else wants to be. They serve flesh only twice a week, Sundays and Thursdays, I believe, Diego Ramirez said. Then Hipólito said, those were the days last time. The rest of the days it is biscuits with rice and beans. Diego Ramirez said, do not lie. We can fish for tuna and sardines. Hipólito said, true. The greatest part is that the dispensero measures every item of food with a scale. Nobody gets shortchanged, nor does anybody get bonuses. I talked with them, learning more about their experiences for some time. Just then, pages started bringing out trestle tables. Diego Ramirez said, here we go. They draped a cloth over it and placed down wooden plates. I went and found my men to inform them we were eating. A page started a prayer. Bless this meal we are about to eat. Let those who have watched tonight be vigilant. Amen. We merged in line, and sure enough, a man with a scale was present. Pages emptied a load of biscuits on the table, enough for 4 people on both ends of the tables. The page that said the prayer announced aloud, supper is served. If you are not here, you are not eating. Our group found a spot to sit together and eat. In my wooden plate, a page dropped the correct portion of vegetable stew with rice. We were given wine to wash down the meal. Let us drink together. May our fortunes drop in our laps, and we remain together always, I said. We banged our glasses together. Around us other crews of soldiers did the same thing. We continued sailing down the Guadalquivir during supper. Check that out. I pointed to the orange and red sunset behind the silhouette of trees. This is exciting, Pedro said. We all were very joyful. After supper, the pages cleared our plates. By now, it was dark, and other pages were scurrying around lighting the last lanterns. A group of us walked up to the prow. About 10 different conversations were going at once. I felt relaxed watching our ship follow the large poop lantern on the Capitana. After this, I told everyone I was going down to try to sleep in the fishnet, which I did. In the morning, I was up on the main deck looking at our country. We kept sailing down the river all day. That evening, we arrived at another port. We spent a night at this port. The following morning, our fleet was augmented by receiving more heavier vessels. In their hulls were everything the colonists needed in the New World. I saw livestock, weapons, and casks of water loaded onto the ships. These ships were filled with so many valuables. Look at the size of the water casks, I said to Philippe. I know. They are almost as tall as the men loading them, he replied. We had stevedores bringing sealed boxes on board the San Indalecio. I asked one of them, is that box filled with gold ducados? One of the stevedores answered with a smile, no, your biscuits are in here. That is what you are going to be eating every day. I shook my head as they continued on to the hatchway. Another squadron of soldiers boarded, as well as a few more mariners, apparently Seville. The only thing in our hull, then, was the guns and our crew. This is because the riverbed from here to the sea could now safely encounter our draft. The fleet was ready, and we departed for Cadiz. The timing on the tide was flawless. Crowds along the pier waved goodbye to their loved ones. Captain Francisco Augustin again introduced himself to the 25 soldiers that just came aboard and led a blessing. Along the Guadalquivir, more people came to its banks to watch this spectacle. 1,000 people sailing down the Guadalquivir. It was an amazing sight. We sailed downstream for several days. The entire course had markers along the banks, reliably showing where sandbars are located. These helpful signs were for the pilots to note. However, other obstacles periodically protruded from the water's surface, such as ship holes at failed careening sites. This must have aggravated the pilots, especially if one were hidden enough to clip one's keel. Finally, on Saturday, May the 5th, 6 days after leaving Seville, one of the officers screamed out, Sanlúcar de Barrameda sandbar is coming up. I have been told by a few to be a curious person. Since we left Seville, I could not stop thinking about how much enjoyment the pilot and his crew must be having. So I moved closer to understand what they were doing. I saw one man steering, and suddenly another man took over as pilot. "We are almost at Cadiz," one of the other pilots said. There was commotion on the deck. Everyone became excited because Cadiz was in sight. I went back to focusing on these pilots as we entered the mouth of the Guadalquivir. I overheard them encourage the one pilot saying, "Juan, nice and easy." Another said, "First time and he looks like a natural." This man was so applauded for being a pilot. All of a sudden, mariners yelped out that his ship had hit the sandbar. I ran over to the stern castle. Already a group of spectators had amassed. I elbowed through to see. Sure enough, where the water shoals, a ship named the Santo Domingo rested. Not far behind her, another ship was approaching. "No, no, you fool! Steer larboard side!" a mariner screamed. Those familiar with the sandbar started waving their hands in the direction to go. "They are going to hit!" another mariner shouted. We were silent, everyone hoping the second ship would steer away from the sandbar. In a tragic series of events, the La Magdalena hit this sandbar as well. We all gasped. I said aloud, "Can you believe a few varas on the Santo Domingo's larboard and she would be fine?" A mariner looked at me and said, "Both those pilots should be fined for that. I do not know who put them in charge." "I agree," I said. He and the other mariners were called over and told to stop staring. "Drop the anchors, men, and lower the yards," the captain yelled to them. We were mooring at Cadiz for the remaining cargo to be added to the fleet. In the meantime, the Santo Domingo and La Magdalena were both stranded on the sandbar. Within minutes, the dredge fleet came from Cadiz. We stood and watched the rescue from the stern castle. I said to Pedro, "I'm glad our pilot avoided that." "I know. How long do you think this will delay us?" Pedro asked me. "I do not know. Hopefully only a few hours," I said. Someone in the crowd commented, "Could be all day, or worse, several days." "This is terrible," Pedro said. An hour later, the Santo Domingo was ready to be rescued. In that time, 2 tenders removed her crew and stevedores removed some of her cargo. Lines ran between her and 2 shallops. The criminals, gypsies, and former vagrants rowing on board the shallops were shouted to by their commander. In unison, they rowed their oars, slightly dragging out the Santo Domingo with each thrust. Finally, the Santo Domingo escaped from the sandbar. Cheers emanated from every ship. The Santo Domingo had its few remaining mariners on board, peering over her gunwale. She was moored at the pier in Cadiz. La Magdalena would not move. Over the day, high tide ebbed, and La Magdalena was left pitching on her prow. The following day, La Magdalena was unladen with most of her cargo. When high tide was back, she then was pulled out by the shallops. Mariners were predicting that she would not take part in the Carrera de Indias fleet because her keel could be damaged. I said to a mariner standing beside me, "The Capitan General should find a replacement so we can move on." The mariner replied, "It is a good idea, but there probably are not any other ships in Cadiz." The day slowly passed. We sat around as carpenters and divers and other experts examined La Magdalena. Around sunset, Captain Francisco Agustin spoke. "Listen up, everyone. The Admiral has informed me that the keel on La Magdalena is leaking. A replacement ship is to be outfitted tonight. In the morning we should be ready to continue as planned." We were forced to remain in Cadiz for an extra night. I woke in the morning and saw the fleet completely ready. Salvos echoed through the air, the final anchor was pulled in, and the perfect breeze struck us. Captain Francisco Agustin yelled out, "Take a good look, men. We are leaving España for a year." Screams of joy came from soldiers and mariners. I was so excited I slapped the railing around the stern castle. Philippe, Antonio, and Pedro mimicked me. Our propriety was to jump around in excitement, it seemed. An hour after leaving Cadiz, the open sea pilot took control. At this point, the drummers and trumpeters started making their racket. This signified that the captain was going to address the ship. 30 more men had come aboard since the San Indalecio left Seville. We all crowded the main deck. "Now that we are officially departing for the Indias Occidentales, I will introduce myself. I am Captain Francisco Agustin of the San Indalecio. The protocols of soldiers and mariners' contracts are simple to follow. I will address the shared rules first. Soldiers and mariners, this applies to both parties. If any of you are caught acting insubordinate to your officers, you will be scourged. If anyone gets caught stealing, you will be tied by a rope and tossed overboard and towed. I have done this twice. Now, if you slay another, you and your unfortunate victim are bound together and tossed overboard. No tow rope will be attached to you. Soldiers, this goes for you. If and when we make contact with the enemy, you are to follow the commands of Capitan Alonso de Zorita and his officers." "Captain Alfonso, is a good man. Captain Alfonso attended the University of Salamanca and is skilled in naval warfare. In fact, we served together in the Azores. Capitan Francisco Agustin then directed his speech to Capitan Alfonso. It is coming up on 3 years since then. Captain Alfonso looked at Capitan Francisco Agustin and replied, Already? Yes. Well, would you like to say a few words to your soldiers? Capitan Alfonso stepped onto the rostrum. Welcome, men. For many of you, this is your first time on a ship. Soon, moments of feeling miserable from being at sea will arrive. However, know that we will make it to the Indias Occidentales. We will make it because of discipline. There is one concern of mine. I will tell you right now, be respectful to mariners. They maintain this ship. If under certain situations, Capitan Francisco Agustin or his officers need any of you to pull lines or make oakum, step forward willingly. Remember that Capitan Francisco Agustin has been appointed by Señor Felipe II himself. The officer next in command of you soldiers is Alferez Alonso Francisco Arellano. He too has experience fighting on land and at sea. Under Alferez Alonso Francisco Arellano's command and mine is Sargente Felipe Beltran. The Alferez and Sergeant stepped forward when hearing their names mentioned. Capitan Alfonso continued his speech. One last item of importance. If you think that you can relax during this voyage, you signed with the wrong ship. Capitan, I am finished. Capitan Francisco Agustin spoke again. Listen to me, mariners, and soldiers too. Next to my nautical command is the chief pilot, Simon. Simon is a graduate of the Indias Pilot Academy and will steer us safely through calm or rough weather. Next in command is Master Enriquez de Sayas. A bald, heavy-set man with a grey mustache raised his hand in the officers' line. Capitan Francisco Agustin said to Enriquez, Come forward. Master Enriquez de Sayas stepped over and introduced himself. As you have just heard, my name is Master Enriquez de Sayas. My career started as a page, before most of you were born. Today I am the master of the San Indalecio. This will be my 7th voyage commanding her. You mariners I have already met. As for the soldiers on board, I ask for one thing. Do not obstruct or antagonize my mariners. Obviously they will reciprocate that order. He stopped his speech and said to Captain Francisco Agustin, I am done. The Capitan and Master exchanged spots where they stood. Capitan Francisco Agustin said, Master Enriquez has done a wonderful job, as I see it, of helping provision this ship. Under command of Master Enriquez is his retainer, Casas Rojas. He assists him with running this vessel. Without the Master's retainer, many crucial parts of this ship would fall into disorder. Would you like to say anything? He asked one of the officers. A man around the age of Alferez Arellano passed off the opportunity. The captain continued. If you would like to know what's under the corset of the San Indalecio, Master Enriquez, or the Master's retainer Casas Rojas, will give you sea virgins a tour. He asked Master Enriquez when the best time would be for this. The Master said in an hour. After hearing this, the captain said, Our imminent course is that in several days we will be at Islas Canarias. It is a group of islands off of Africa. This run is going to be the most difficult for you men unfamiliar with the sea. I ask that you trust me when I say you will make it. Now, rest for an hour. Capitan Francisco Agustin walked away. The crowd dissipated. I heard the part about before arriving at the Islas Canarias. The real challenges will begin. I scoffed at it. So, Antonio, Pedro, Philip, and I walked to the stern. We stood watching the merchant and warships sail. Warships like the San Indalecio sail on a merchant ship's larboard or starboard side. About 100 varas off our starboard was the 3-masted merchant ship San Olegario. Abaft the San Olegario was the terminal merchant ship, the San Quinteria, which has 2 masts and is Latin-rigged. Off the San Quinteria's stern sails the heavier San Fructus, known as the Admiranta. It is a 4-masted galleon that sails as the admiral's ship. Smaller reinforcement ships sail between the fleet. They carry smaller casks of food and water on board, probably loaded on the wrong ships back in Cadiz. A patache sails between the Capitana and the San Fructus as a communications vessel for the fleet. The total number of ships was 28 in our fleet, including the San Indalecio. Over half were carracks, filled with merchants' valuables. San Olegario and San Quinteria had passengers visible on their decks. They appeared minuscule in comparison to their ships. We were extremely exuberant to view this power. The ability of España to gather together this many people proves our dominance over the world. This many ships and with this much treasure sailing for thousands of leagues is the true meaning of power. It made me feel glad that My father and his fathers were of pure blood. Pedro said, "This is such a big event. I mean, look at this." "Do you see why I want to learn about these ships?" I said. Philippe said, "Definitely." The wind blew through my hair. It felt so good to look up and watch the sails harnessing the wind, moving us rapidly in the direction desired. Then, glancing at the other ships, I understood that with power comes competition. Despite the grandeur of our fleet, our enemies were on the horizon. This made me pause and consider the seriousness of the matter. Pedro said, "This is so exciting. I want to remember this when I am an old, old man." "This is where the money is. I mean, all these officers and their families are wealthy, because they are making money for Signor Felipe II, I said. Philip replied, "This whole show is so complex. Look at all the people. Each one of them is allotted gunpowder, food, weapons. God, does the Captain General have a grip on this world or what?" Pedro said, "Captain General gets a ring from the king and a special sword once he is chosen. That is it. The person that devotes the most time and energy is Jose Tapis, the victualler." I said, "I heard that too. He does do all the work and gets most of the profit." "What does the victualler do?" Philip asked us. "The Captain General does not really do what you said. The victualler gathers the rations for all of us. Like you were saying with the gunpowder and food, not the Captain General," I told Philippe. "Yes, but can you imagine the value of each ship?" Philippe replied. Pedro threw a figure out. "Tens of thousands of ducados." "Pedro, how do you know?" Antonio asked. He said, "I talked to Alferez Aliano. This is how I know." "Tens of thousands of ducados is invested." Philip noted it with his eyebrows raised. "Damn, we get 4 a month," Antonio said. We stood looking at the ships behind us in amazement. Finally we heard a whistle. We walked over to the mainmast. There the master was standing with his retainer and another man. This was our first encounter with these officers up close. Master Enriquez had eyes that were very judgmental. Master Enriquez began speaking. "I hope your health is overall tolerable. I know that soldiers on their first trip tend to get violently ill. So if you begin getting sick, inform an officer immediately. We do not want you vomiting everywhere. Next to me is my retainer. This is Casas Rojas. Casas Rojas has sailed with me for the last 3 years and will take over from here." The master's retainer stepped forward and spoke. "As you heard, I am Casas Rojas. This is Mateus the Guardian, my assistant." He asked him which tour this is. "Third," Mateus responded with a surprisingly feminine voice. Casas continued. "Mateus watches how you use lanterns and candles. Hopefully with his keen eyes he will prevent a fire. Introduce yourself, Mateus." "Bless you all, and it is a pleasure to meet you," he said. Casas continued. "Get to know the echelon on board. It will remove any cloudy thoughts of working on a warship. Now, are there any important questions?" After the discussion I just had, I decided to speak. "How much is the San Indalecio worth in ducados?" Casas said, "Do you mean how much it cost for its construction or to outfit?" "It costs more to outfit than build, averaging 50 ducados a tonelada." "That is more than some people see in a lifetime," I thought. Another soldier asked, "What type of guns are on board?" "I will show you in a moment," Casas said. Casas began his tour. "Follow me, men. During my tour, do not distract the crew working. We will start here at the main deck." Casas then spoke to Mateus. "Manage this watch with Master Enriquez." Mateus went to help the master as we walked towards the stern. We descended down a flight of steps into the gunroom. Our group passed the mizzenmast and the capstan. Casas spoke up. "San Indelicio's artillery comes from the Basque region. Here, as you can see, are a total of 10 culverins, each about 4 varas long." Our crew just looked at these weapons in awe. "They are divided equally on both sides. The caliber is the relationship between 2 measurements, the barrel's length, the diameter of its bore. That amounts to 24 caliber for each culverin. This piece of cloth you see attached to the hull above every gun has the caliber written on it." He looked round at us. "We have that in place in case there is a Catalan amongst you." We all laughed at his humor. Casas continued. "The culverin is capable of throwing 18 libra balls over 2,000 varas. I had seen them in action on land, but was hopeful to see one of these fire someday. Casas resumed his lesson. "Next, we have the demi-culverins. There are 8, each throwing 9 libra iron balls. As you have seen above deck, there are exactly 10 breech-loading sakers throwing 4 libra balls." We continued to walk through the gun deck. "The San Indalecio has 2 cannons. Here is one. The second is starboard side." He pet the cannon. If you look at the cloth strip hanging from the carriage, you read on it 20 caliber. Gunners work on 7 consecutive guns in battle. These 2 cannons, you see, weigh over 1,000 libras each, costing the crown close to 100 ducados. Be smart with them. They may kill us as easily as our enemies. Our group began strolling back towards the stern. Alonso, look at this I found. Antonio laughingly pointed at the cannon's carriage. Someone had carved with a knife in the wooden crossbeam, Tartarus lover. Seeing that made me realize what type of people gunners are. Casas kept speaking. At the very stern of this deck is the captain's cabin. Above the captain's cabin is the officer's cabin and part of the quarterdeck. Above the officer's cabin is the poop deck. As we walked by the hatchway, I looked down it. Beneath the iron bars was blackness. Casas said, Let me show you the steerage room quickly. He walked down steps into what he called the orlop deck. So our group followed him. He started looking for a key on a chain. After a delay, he began cursing to himself about someone named Martin. Eventually, he unlocked the short door to the steerage room. We filed in one at a time. We had a chance to see 4 mariners hauling and slacking the line in and out of tackles. That is how the rudder moves. I also noticed 2 stern chasers located behind the men. Casas said, Watch your feet over the sweep. As you see, this is what the tiller rests on. He patted the tiller and continued his lecture. The whip staff attaches to the tiller. The helmsman views what is going on with the sails through the gated opening in front of him. These men control the tiller and concentrate on hearing commands spoken by me or the master or Simon above deck. Pedro asked, How are commands heard in battle with guns firing? Casas answered, That is a very sharp question. Takes years of experience. We walked out and Casas closed the door behind the last one in our queue. We kept pace with Casas. This is the hearth, as most of you who boarded in Seville know by now. We walked by the pile of logs used for cooking and making ash. Here is the powder magazine below the forepeak, accessible through the pair of scuttles above us. Our group walked up the companionway onto the gun deck, and then up further. We were back on the bright, sunny main deck. Well, men, on all the warships of España, the crew is divided into mariners and gunners. Mariners are the able-bodied ship custodians. Usually many of them have years of experience with sailing and being at sea. Despite your prejudices, mariners are hard workers. The soldiers, that is all of you, defend the ship from enemies attempting to board. You all have been trained on land, therefore think of the San Indelicio as your territory. Once in battle, sometimes you will be asked to help the gunners. We all looked at each other, surprised to hear this. Casas continued, Soldiers and gunners will be interacting often with each other. Gather as much knowledge of their duties as you can. I will be back. Casas ran up the steps to the quarterdeck and fetched someone. He returned with a man noticeably shorter with bushy eyebrows. Casas spoke. This is Hernan Sus Navar. He trains the gunners. Hernan spoke up. You soldiers may come under my command. To make you aware of my credentials, know that I was personally selected by Capitan Francisco Agustin to this position. I load the weapons on and off this ship and train my men to use them properly. I am going to share with you what I know. He silently walked down the companionway onto the gun deck. We all followed him, assuming that is what he expected. Hernan spoke up. When in battle, and our broadside is engaged, and you are manning the opposing side's guns, do not stand idle. You are to make certain the axles on your carriages are greased. Know if your barrels are unplugged or not. If you can, help apprentices with everyone's shot lockers. After that, your side's guns are usually ready to be fired. He started walking over to the larboard cannon. After 3 shots, always cool the barrel with vinegar and salt water. He pointed down at the bucket. Here is a quick lesson on how these guns are prepared. Powder charge is rammed down the barrel like this, all the way to the breech. It is wrapped in canvas, so it can take a little abuse. Use this long-handled rammer. He was holding a wooden pole about 3 varas long. Hernan continued, I will see to it that powder charges are prepared daily. It is important the charges you shove down the barrel have a little windage. I will show you that later. Next, grab some old rags from here and stuff them down the barrel. Hernan finished this and selected one of the soldiers. You there, what is your name? A lanky man stepped forward. With an accent he said, Juan. Hand me that iron ball there, Juan. The 40 libra one. Careful with her, she stores weight, Hernan said. He received it and continued saying, Once the ball is lowered into the cannon, add more wad to keep it in place. I knew that the cannon had to be brought forward. Which ropes pull this forward? I asked Hernan. He leaned forward and pointed to the correct ones. I called out for Philippe to help me. We quickly hauled her close to the gun port. Thank you, men. Did you all see how they did that? Hernan asked. The rest of the soldiers saw how we slid the cannon forward. Hernan continued, "Now that the cannon is in place, we use our powder horn. Pour some in the vent. Always be liberal with this. Now it is ready to fire." We all looked at this heavy, large weapon. Everybody was patiently waiting for it to be fired. "The operation of this can be very easy if you understand the instrument. Angles are adjusted with coins. Last but not least, the linstock over here." He walked over and picked one of dozens. "This we use to ignite the pan which fires the cannon." Hernan called up to Casas. "The larboard cannon is charged." Casas shouted to one of the pilots, and then an affirmative reply came back to Hernan's ears. We heard Casas blow a whistle and prepare the ship. Hernan said, "Again, some of your soldiers will help in here when we are engaged." Hernan lit the linstock and touched the powder at the touch hole. He started blowing the ignition until it brightened up and smoke and sparks spewed. He quickly stepped back and folded his arms. The combustion spread inside until it reached the powder charge. With what could have been mistaken for thunder next to us, she fired. I blinked and instantly felt its power hit my chest. Smoke exploded out and filled the room with a pungent odor of burnt rope and gunpowder. A couple of men left and clapped. "Power to control the seas, right here, men. Now, mariners will haul back the gun after it is fired. But let me get 2 volunteers. You 2. Hernan selected his men. "Good. You use the tackles which aid in keeping this field carriage in place. Pull it in position like this." The heavy cannon was pulled back to its original location. "The gun can be reloaded. It is easy to load and the rammer has space. However, a gunner's job is more difficult than you think. He has to perfect aiming it." My ears were still ringing from the blast. It is one thing firing these in a field, but in a confined space it is another. Nonetheless, it was exciting. Hernan said, "Good. You freshmen talk to Casas up on the main deck and learn about the sails dynamics." We started walking up to daylight. Hernan said, "One last item of importance. If any of you happen to become acquainted in battle with these weapons, do so on an empty stomach." In battle, what Diego Ramirez and his men do is amazing. Loading culverines and cannons, carefully moving gunpowder, then firing and cycling through this procedure is tough work. Their ears must be shot for days after a conflict. We went back on the main deck. Casas was listening to Capitan Francisco Agustin speak. Casas then looked at us and said, "The cannon is a large caliber gun. Did any of you get startled from it?" A few replied that it was powerful. "I can take over," Capitan Francisco Agustin said to Casas. Casas nodded his head and said, "I am going to check for frayed lines." With that he began scaling up towards the mainmast. We all looked at him as he climbed. Capitan Francisco Agustin said, "Men, look here. I will quickly give a lesson on sailing, because it is important for you to know. In battle, men, the main advantage is to gain the weather gauge. That means we are upwind from our enemy. When we are upwind, the San Indalecio sails the best. We are not upwind, then we are tacking against the wind. Each starboard tack and larboard tack exposes our broadside. All the mariners, including the apprentices and pages, understand what to do. Soldiers, you just observe the San Indalecio in her glory at this point. Both tactics will increase our chances of achieving a victory. However, we are dependent on the wind and current all the time. I want you men to look up at the main canvas." I counted 8 sails, but the main one was obvious. "Do you see those lines with blocks running up and down it connecting to the middle sail? Those are what help raise and lower the sail. The clew lines pull the lower corners up to the center. Releasing the clew lines has the opposite effect. The third line is the bunt line, which raises the middle part of the cloth. If you watch the mariners at work, you will get a picture of how the ship sails. Be still and listen to Master Enriquez." In front of us, we watched as mariners followed the master's instructions. Master Enriquez said, "Keep your lines tight on the larboard." Mariners on both sides held onto the foresail lines that attached to knobs protruding from the deck. There were 10 mariners of different sized proportions, yet each looked as strong as an ox. I turned around to look how the other sails behaved. They were just flapping in the wind. Capitan Francisco Agustin said, "Mainsails and mizzensails follow the wind." The mariners behind us began pulling their lines. I could feel the whole ship suddenly move more quickly as we changed direction. Capitan Francisco Agustin said, "Do you see how the foresails did not move until the prow completed the tack? That is how you sail with the wind." We all looked back at the foresail. The angle on the foresail had changed direction now. Capitan Francisco Agustin continued, "The yards are what the sails are attached to. The halyards control their movement. This mechanism of controlling the sail's movement with these lines exists throughout the ship. Together it is known as the rigging. The lowest sail is the course, the middle is the topsail, and topgallant sail is the tallest. The mainmast is surrounded abaft by the mizzenmast, and the other is the foremast. I looked at my men. They were acting as if they understood. I was attempting to follow his lesson. Capitan Francisco Augustin continued. The mizzenmast yard shifts constantly. As soldiers, if you happen to be up there, be very careful. Several negligent soldiers have been killed by being knocked off when the vessel's heeling. Pedro whispered, "Which one, Alonso?" I pointed to the sails above the stern's mast. Capitan Francisco Augustin continued, "Now I leave the afternoon to your will." Just then, Casas returned. "I am going to my quarters to rest before my watch. Casas, go ahead." Casas said, "Shifts last every 4 hours for mariners. Volunteers are welcome to help. Until then, keep out of the path of those working." We broke up into our separate crews. We had a leisurely time talking. Pedro pulled out his cards. "Do you want to play La Hombre?" We all decided to play. "Who is dealing?" Antonio asked. Pedro said, "I am." "Good, that means you sit out," Antonio replied. Pedro dealt to Philip, Antonio, and me. While dealing, Pedro asked, "Do you men recall how we got here?" "Yes, you fool, we showed up for muster before setting sail," Antonio said. "No, Antonio, I mean, when we were in the Hermanidad." Pedro responded. Everyone had their cards now. I told Philip and Antonio, "I am betting 3 reales I will get this round." Philip and Antonio matched this stake. "Impossible," Philip said, looking at his cards. I responded to Pedro's question. "I remember. Felipe Beltran planted his pikestaff in our town and I approached him to sign on." Pedro said, "That seems so long ago. Now we are here." "It does seem like a dream when I recall that day," I said. Pedro said, "I bet when we come back next year they will need us to fight the English." "Possibly. Bad news arrives every month, it seems," I replied. "Damn it, Alonso," Philippe said. I won the first round. That meant, according to the rules, I continued leading the game. I said to Pedro, "We would have stayed in the Hermanidad, but these merchant ships need protection." "Yes, so here we are in this spacious and cozy ship," Antonio sarcastically said. "It is exciting to be away from home like this," I said. Antonio said, "True, we could be living as we had been in our old lives." Everyone agreed. I quickly won 4 more rounds. Philippe and Antonio, frustrated, paid me. Pedro then asked the group, "The sergeant said to us after we signed on at the registrar, this was going to require new levels of devotion. Do you men think about what that meant?" I just sat back counting my reales and said, "We are soldiers on land. For us to be sent to the new world is unique. We are an experiment. Along the way we are going to learn more complex military duties. That is why I am going to learn about sailing. My family has connections with the military. I encouraged my brothers, Pedro, Antonio, and Felipe, to join our province's militia. I knew it would improve their lives. A few months ago, when the opportunity came to sail with the Carrera de Indias fleet, we jumped for it." I asked, "Do you men remember what you were doing before we joined the Hermanidad?" Antonio said, "Yes, Felipe and I were in school. We were wasting time as the world had indulged in finer things." Pedro said, "Working for my lousy father." Pedro's father is a gunsmith in a foundry. His father was commissioned by the military due to his expertise in weaponry. Like Pedro's grandfather, Pedro's father, Bartolome, physically abused Pedro as a child. They were evicted from several homes for evading taxes. Pedro's mother was apparently a laundress. She died giving birth to him. Pedro's father, I feel, holds his son in contempt. It is a wretched thing. Pedro responded, "Building up weapons is not as joyful as firing them. I better be promoted to carrying an arquebus. Alferez Arellano needs to guarantee that." I said, "There is a good chance. Andres was issued one when he was in this fleet a couple years ago." "Philippe is a coward, Alonso. Why do you associate with him?" Philippe always badmouths this old friend of mine. Andres is the leader of a squadron stationed in Países Bajos. "It's 20 more reales a month if you hold an arquebus," I said. Philippe said, "I would like to have one, especially if we get a pay increase." Antonio said, "What for, Philippe? You will shoot yourself in the foot before you shoot anyone else." "Antonio, have you ever shot an arquebus?" Philippe asked. Everyone looked for Antonio's response. "No," Antonio replied. Everyone heckled Antonio for being outwitted. "You two have an aiming contest," I suggested. "The better shooter pays 3 reales, Antonio said. They all agreed. Later that day we had supper as usual. By now, all the tablecloths had become filthy, yet the biscuits continued being plopped on top of dirty stains and week-old food particles. After supper, Philip, Pedro, Antonio, and I went up to the prow. We were leaning on the prow's rail, watching our fleet follow the Capitana's poop lantern. There were mariners sleeping near us on the deck. A few were heard spitting out their chewed tobacco before retiring. We tried to be quiet. "I cannot even imagine what lays before us," I said. "We will be in the New World for a year. That is something," Pedro said. "I am ready for whatever may come our way," I said. "Same with me. I hope all of us are ready," Pedro said. "But I would be more ready if I had money," I said. "With or without money, we will be fine. Enjoy the moment of sailing across the sea. Doesn't it make you feel alive?" Pedro asked. One of the mariners demanded that we leave because he was to be called forth for the pilot's midnight watch. We spoke more quietly. Pedro whispered, "Have you noticed that mariners act tough? They act like we are trespassing on their domain." "I agree," Philip responded. Pedro continued, "This mariner stepped on my foot today. He said nothing but kept on walking." "That is wrong," Philip said. "I feel if that were a fellow soldier he would have said something. I do not care, though. Maybe that was an isolated incident. I was just looking around at the suckers, paying no attention to him," Pedro explained. Antonio said, "I was told before signing up that mariners are scum. They travel far from land, associating for months only amongst themselves. Some are escaped prisoners and others are vagabonds." I smirked, listening to Antonio. He was saying it loud enough for all of them to hear. Then one of the soldiers standing guard ordered us to disperse. Pedro said to the soldier, "We hear you. Anyway, I do not care about the incident. Nobody can ruin my pleasure of being here. I was just wondering if any of you picked up on it," Pedro said. I looked at this as a bad omen. Pedro briefly mentioning an altercation, and it was our first night out at sea. I said, "I am going to sleep down in my hammock." We all took one last glance at the fleet sailing.